I guess I didn't start recording till now. Welcome to my presentation on women and feminism in Soviet Russia, roughly from 1920 until its collapse in 1991. Here is a timeline of Soviet leadership. We see Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, and then Gorbachev at the bottom before the fall in 1991. We will talk mostly about Lenin and Stalin in these, but about Gorbachev as well, and how the feminism movement was progressing into the end of the Soviet Union. So the February and October revolutions of 1917 were the first major step leading to the formation of the Soviet Union in 1922. As Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown and the 300-year-long Romanov rule in Russia ended. After the failure of efforts to exit the First World War, the October Revolution ensued, led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, marking a social and governmental shift away from Tsarism and toward socialist and communist ideals. As early as the turn of the 20th century, Bolshevik attitudes toward women were much more progressive than previously seen under the Tsarist regime. The 1917 revolution slogan became peace, land, and bread, notably addressing the food scarcity, which was severe at the time, and acknowledging women as equal partners in the fight toward a better life. Women were a large part of especially the Second World War in Soviet Russia. And the ever-growing opposition to continue fighting in wars, the World War II notably, attracted poor Russians to the early Bolshevik proposals, hoping to achieve comfort at home and in the form of security, safety, and plentiful resources like food to live day to day. All right. So the Bolsheviks, they did have a more progressive view toward women. However, there was some shortcomings in the actual practice of the Bolshevik policies. So on Women's Day of February, in February of 1917, strikes ensued by factory and plant working women due to the demand for bread, part of the February Revolution. Much of the feminist effort at the time was related to workers' rights and the dignity of the work of women. And it attracted alignment with the Bolsheviks, who at first agreed to support the concerns of these poor women. Throughout the reign of the Soviet Union, however, little was officially done by the government to uplift women in particular. Under Lenin and the Bolsheviks, women's rights did see legislative improvement, such as the enabling of easier divorce in 1918, legalization of abortion in 1920. The Women's Bureau, which I believe is pronounced Zenotdel, was formed in 1919 to organize women and further encourage political participation, and that was led by Alexandra Kollontai and Ines Armand. These were, however, still the early days of the Soviet Union in the 20s, and much more would progress after this. And we'll later see the reversal of many women's rights efforts. So despite the improvements in legislative action taken until Lenin's death, Bolshevik power failed to truly liberate women from the patriarchal family system that we see in the historical context of Russia, regarding family, church, things like that. This is especially evident in the shift back toward the totalitarian rule under Stalin and regression of rights granted in the beginning years of Lenin's rule. All right, Lenin to Stalin. So there was a shift that occurred. After Lenin's death in 1924, his successor, Joseph Stalin, assumed the leadership role for the USSR. Their differences depict important factors in the transformation of the nation under Stalin. including Stalin's socialism in one country model that negated Lenin's priority of global revolution, focusing more on industry at home and building up the country from within. Um, the policy marks a transition in the governing actions of Russia, including a change from traditional Marxist views toward favoring the self-strengthening of industries within the country, which led to the rapid industrialization and agricultural collectivism during his five-year plan era from about 1928 to 1932. The Great Retreat in the mid 1930s marks a time in Soviet history wherein efforts of formally granted women's and otherwise rights backslid and were made illegal. Examples of that are the criminalization of homosexuality, which was formerly decriminalized after the 1917 revolutions, and the Bolshevik group coming into power. So the criminalization of homosexuality, formerly decriminalized, homosexuality was criminalized by Stalin in about 1933 formally. Efforts were done around that time to kind of become more conservative in the ways that power was consolidated. And dissent was not favored, per se. So abortion rights also were overturned in 1936. And it's important to mention that the censorship under Stalin was fierce. He was not somebody who took kindly to opposition. And an excerpt from C.L.R. James's 1937 work of the World Revolution comments on this, saying, the fate of Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Radek, and Buchanan, Rykov, and Tomsky, forgive me for the pronunciation, warned all who dare to oppose. Their personal supporters would be ruthlessly cut away. They themselves would be accused of counter-revolution in the Stalinist-controlled press. Stalin's majority would condemn them, and they would have to take the road to exile or make humiliating confessions of penitence. So now we move on to pioneers of the women's rights era, less of an era, more of a continued effort. All right, so women's rights activists and feminists shaped the Soviet Union. They include, of course, Nadezhda Krupskaya, who was a prominent Bolshevik revolutionary and was married to Vladimir Lenin. Alexandra Kollontai, which we mentioned earlier, she's most known for her involvement in the creation of the women's organization Zenotdel and her Marxist feminist views. Inessa Armand was born in France, but became a prominent French-Russian communist politician, spending most of her life in Russia and also aligned with the Bolsheviks, and was a close friend of Vladimir Lenin in the early 1920s. Again, forgive me for my pronunciation. Ludmila Pavlichenko, the first of these women to be born in the 20th century, went on to be the deadliest female sniper in world history. She had 309 confirmed kills during World War II. And then Elena Lagadinova contributed to the Bulgarian efforts opposing German occupation during World War II, in addition to being an agriculturist and genetic engineer. So here's like another, there we go. It's a better view of all 5 of these women. And so they are all examples of a progressing and sustained effort to secure more equality for women in Russia. And most of these actions occurred in the first half of the 20th century, so about 1900 to 1950, 60. Um, yeah, and all of this was, again, before the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So, on this slide, we have an excerpt from an ex-Soviet activist. She was exiled. I'll explain that in a moment. As one can imagine, censorship of marginalized communities in the USSR was almost certain. Feminism in Russia began to emerge as a movement in the early 1980s, formally, despite the censorship efforts and control over publishing regarding, the Russian population. We see here in this slide that in 1980, at a conference in the United States, this Russian woman, Tatiana Mamonova, discusses her views on feminism after being exiled for publishing issues of the first Russian feminist almanac. So she created this, she posted a few issues, and then was subsequently stripped of her rights and exiled from Russia. Let's see. The almanac is called Women in Russia, and it began to be published in 1979. It is interesting to note that her take on the church's involvement in feminist efforts, as published in this almanac, leaned toward anti-Christianization. And she says in this interview directly that the almanac attacks the church. The distinction of separation of religiosity from feminist efforts is likely the culprit of censorship and subsequent exile. We know that even with the lessening of restrictions on religion, that the Orthodox Christian Church has historically been very influential on Russian culture. And so this expose of sorts threatened the image of the USSR from their perspective. All right. Glasnost and Perestroika. So the sexual socialization of the 1970s was an era of puritanical attitudes towards sex, sexuality, and official education standards like sexual education in public schools and things like that. The sexual revolution, though, among generations, challenged the nuclear model family, though women still bore the weight of both domestic and professional workloads. And many Marxist thinkers expanded on the woman problem, is what it was called in Russia. Glasnost and Perestroika, which were established as policy under Mikhail Gorbachev, in 1986 and 1985, respectively, highly influenced women's roles in society under the USSR in the late 1880s. The policy of openness revitalized the progress of the LGBT rights in Russia, as queer folks discussed the progressive laws of the late 19 teens and early 1920s under the Bolsheviks. So there was a revitalization and kind of one of the first times where queer people, women, similar marginalized groups actually could talk to each other and discuss their oppression, their experience, all of the above. So yeah, that influenced feminism as well as the gay rights movement. And the lessening of censorship as a result of Glasnost allowed the expanded communication for queer communities and women's activism spaces alike. So this spread of ideas was helpful in establishing a future for feminist liberation, and certainly empowered the gay rights movement, as I said. Lynn Atwood describes the burden of women in the excerpts on this slide from her 1990 publication, The New Soviet Man and Woman, Sex Role Socialization in the USSR. And she emphasizes that the idea that there is a multiplication of work due for women, and they are expected to take care of both areas of affairs, so home life and work life, to meaningfully contribute to Soviet society, which is, often cited as a double standard because men were only expected to, make money for the family. They weren't as expected to do the nurturing. And so after this, there's a continued fight for equality. Obviously the all the problems that ensued over the course of the Soviet Union were not all fixed by the end of it. In fact, there were many issues also molded the future history for Russia in the aftermath of the collapse. Um, we don't touch on that as much in this PowerPoint, um, but there is much more that does occur for feminism in Russia following the collapse of the Soviet Union. So by 1990, more than half of the Soviet labor force was women, though in the lowest paying sectors. And we can't forget that these women were also often mothers and wives. So domestic duties like child rearing and keeping house were still expected for women who did have families. Education had formerly been prioritized for women in the USSR, but the shift back toward traditional gender roles harmed the progress of feminism for many, and the lives of all Russian women, whether they identified with the movement. Um, Women also faced workplace sexual harassment very often, and they had no protection against these obstacles in their workplace and in their lives. And misogyny molded the state desired direction of women's work. And we see that through the Gorbachev era and after as well. By the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1981, the feminist movement had, I'm so sorry, I got a little bit ahead of myself. Following the Gorbachev era in post-Soviet Russia, there had been a notable shift back to wife, mother, homemaker, a shift away from the factory sphere of work that women had been doing in factories and plants and all of that for a long time. And by the collapse, the feminist movement had established roots in the hearts and minds of many Russian women, even if they were not able to um, enact meaningful change in Russia during this time. They were planting the roots in the soil, so to speak, for the blossoming Russian feminist movement. The final paragraph of an article by, again with the names, Linda Raichiapi and Catherine O'Sullivan-C, describes the importance of interconnectedness between other feminist groups in other regions, seek roots in feminist justice before establishing a distinct Russian version of feminism. And I'll read you the excerpt. She says, activists constantly face essentialist arguments about women that seek to limit Russian women's autonomy and power. In the process of countering the political essentialism that is so powerful today in Russia, many activists are beginning to share resources more readily and to work together in coordinated ways to combat these negative political and economic effects. Through this process, women may develop a common consciousness and come to articulate and advance a uniquely Russian feminism. So she does note how there is a need of kind of education on feminism and progress in other areas before there is a distinct Russian version of feminism in its full form. For women in Russia, the achievement of equal rights and social dignity has been a long battle, and its citizens have endured a well-documented struggle regarding human equity and the desire for control among the rulers. This presentation covers only feminism during Soviet rule, so it's important to know, like I said earlier, that this is not the end of developments in Russia since 1991. Notably, Vladimir Putin, the current leader of Russia, has reverted the decriminalization of queerness and LGBT individuals And as Holmgren said in 2013, the sharp drop in Western funding for gender centers and non-governmental organizations and the consolidation of exclusively masculinist power under Putin have forced most feminine oh my goodness most feminist projects to fold or move under the radar. So there's still much work to do. Lots that has been done post Soviet era, but obviously with the um, Putin leadership, there is still a lot of oppression, repression, and censorship. Um, and hopefully in the future, there are more efforts made toward, you know, progress in Russian feminism. Thanks.